Selecting a data type from the options available presents a table below the summary table with specific mappings for that particular data type. The question mark here gives a brief description of what the column requirements are. The data field is a field that is required to visualize the selected data type. The source data column, this should be populated with the name of the source data file column that maps to the selected data field. You can map multiple columns to one data field, but they must be separated by commas. For some studies, for blinding purposes, information needs to be coded. In this case, if data is required to be coded for blinding purposes, then a separate decoding file can be loaded into the system, and this should be created and mapped into Admin UI before the specific data information is mapped. In the decoding information then, the appropriate decoding information, which is equivalent to the code group name in the decoding file, should be entered into this field. You can also enter a default value. So if you have mapped here a source data column, you can override that by adding a default value here, and in which case this value will be assigned to the React field. There's also aggregation functions. These are functions that allow React to work with complicated mapping requirements. Most of the data types don't require aggregation functions. Aggregation functions are usually required for dates and times, and particularly for some data fields when being mapped for adverse event data. A summary of the aggregation functions will be given a bit later. And then finally, this column here represents whether or not the data is mandatory or not. So mandatory fields cannot be empty. It's advised to start mapping mandatory fields to do some high-level quality checks and ensure that the data is as expected, and then return and do the more complex mappings to build out the visualization. Once this table has been completed, then you need to check the checkbox to confirm that the mappings are correct. When clicking this, you then click Save. And when clicking Save, if there are any issues with the mappings, a warning will be presented at that point, at which point you may be able to accept the warning, or you may be able to continue, or you may need to troubleshoot the warning before continuing. There is some troubleshooting will be covered in the data mapping and loading troubleshooting module, which is a bit later. The aggregation functions described earlier are described in a bit more detail in this table. There are 6 different types of aggregation functions, and the top 3 are the ones that are usually required most commonly. So date assembler, day first, or date assembler, month first. So when you're mapping a date, the appropriate aggregation function is selected to match how the date is represented in the source data file. So if the source data file date is represented by day, month and year, then date assembler date first has to be selected, or month, day, year, in which case date assembler month first is selected. An example of this is visit date. Maximum value. This allows you to select a maximum value from multiple source data columns. When several columns in the source data contain information for a data field, this function allows the maximum value to be selected. An example of this is in the adverse event mapping table, where you have to map maximum severity grade. Array is another function, and this is used only for adverse events, and the values are taken from several source data columns and written into one database column. The individual values will then appear as options in the event filter. As I mentioned earlier, this is only used for adverse events. where action taken due to severity grade changes for investigational drugs and AE severity grade changes. The latter three aggregation functions are less commonly used, but they are available should the need arise. Concatenate just allows you to take long descriptions from several columns in the source data to be collected into one database cell. An example of this is hospitalisation AE description. Another less commonly used aggregation function is data assembler default time day first or data assembler default time month first. This is used when mapping a date and time. The appropriate aggregation function is selected to match how the date is represented in the source data file as described earlier, and this will be followed by the time, which is populated in the default value. An example of this is in the exacerbations, the start date of exacerbation. And finally, array data assembler day first, array data assembler month first. Again, this allows dates to be taken from several source data columns and written into one database column. And here again, as described earlier, the appropriate aggregation function is selected to match how the date is represented in the source data file. There is more detail on aggregation functions with some specific examples in the Admin UI guide, page 56.